Vulnerability is the core of all emotions and feelings. To feel is to be vulnerable. To believe vulnerability is weakness is to believe that feeling is weakness. To foreclose on our emotional life out of fear that the cost will be too high is to walk away from the very thing that gives us purpose and meaning to living. Brene Brown, and that's an excerpt from her book, Daring Greatly. Welcome to the Leading with Vulnerability podcast. I'm your host, Yuma Barnett, and today we have a special episode. Don't turn it off. You don't have to sit here and listen to me the whole time. We're going to do a best of episode. This episode is number 37 of the podcast. I've had some phenomenal guests over the past few months, several months that I've been doing this, and one question I always get from either the guests or people that I see that I watch the show, they ask, why did you start the podcast? And you just heard the answer in the show opening. I read the book Daring Greatly by Brene Brown, and those lines from that one paragraph at the beginning of the book changed my whole view about vulnerability, purpose, and the importance of storytelling. And for this, the 37th episode of the Leading with Vulnerability podcast, we're going to take a look back on some of the answers to the one question I ask of every guest that comes on the show. What is your definition of vulnerability? Hearing the answers to that one question is probably my favorite part of every interview, because they're all unique, they're all a little bit different, but they all still kind of have an underlying theme that ties them all together. And I think you're going to enjoy listening to the 13 people I chose to share their definition of vulnerability on today's show. It's just a great way to listen to that and get a feel for what this show is if you've never listened to it. Back to back on the people's take on vulnerability and leadership and how vulnerability ties into it. So to kick this all off, we're going to start with Don Barden. Don is one of the smartest people I know. He's one of the nicest people I know. He's one of the most generous people you'll ever meet. And if you own a business or you want to start your own business or go down an entrepreneurial track, I highly recommend you go back and check out Don Barden's episode. It's one of the episodes that I get the most feedback on after people listen to it. I've had multiple people tell me they've listened to that episode multiple times. And just the nuggets that Don gives over his years of being a businessman are invaluable. So definitely after you hear this episode and everybody's definitions of a vulnerability, go back and check some of those episodes out in their entirety if you'd like to. They're all great. But specifically, if you're in the business realm or want to chase a business path, Don is a great place to start. So we'll get started with Don Barden. Get straight into it, straight into the topic of,
Sure.
of this podcast. You've been in business your whole life.
Yeah.
Husband, father. What's vulnerability mean to you?
Vulnerability. That's a great question. I think vulnerability is about being honest. It's about accepting from a leadership position who you are. And I mean, it's a huge question. You ask all these big questions. This is great. Like, how do you answer this in one sit down? But vulnerability is about being honest, accepting who you are, knowing what your unique ability is, and knowing what you're excellent at, knowing what you're competent at, knowing what you're incompetent at,
Absolutely.
and admitting it, and finding other people around you that your incompetence is actually their unique ability, and that when you come together that you can accomplish great things if everybody's working on the same team. But I told somebody the other day in preparation for this, I was so excited about coming down and being on your show. I said, it's about vulnerability. And they said, well, how would you define vulnerability? And I said, well, it's kind of like this concept that fear and courage are not mutually exclusive. They can live side by side. So my kind of running joke on this is fear is what happens when you wet your pants. Courage is what you do when you're wearing wet pants.
Oh, wow.
And every leader out there faces that moment, right? And you just have to be vulnerable and stand up saying, yeah, this isn't what I expected you to see today, but we've got to move forward. And it's about being honest and And understanding that fear and courage are not exclusive of each other. They can live side by side. And in leadership, you have to be able to harness both of them and move forward. And I think that's the key to vulnerability.
I hope you guys enjoyed listening to Don's definition of vulnerability to kick this whole show off. And up next, the clip comes from episode number 2 of the podcast, my first episode with a guest. And the guest is Jennifer Hartung. And she gives a great take on vulnerability and her kids and where that ties in with her kids and her life as a lifelong military spouse. And I want to just say thanks again to Jen for being the first person to come on the show and help me kick this whole Leading with Vulnerability podcast off. And we'll get to number 2, Jennifer Hartung. You can't be on the Leading with Vulnerability podcast if you don't tell me what your definition of vulnerability is.
I think the definition of vulnerability could be several different terms or directions. Vulnerability could be walking around veterans at 12 o'clock at night without a firearm. Vulnerability.
Veterans Parkway.
Veterans Parkway, just so we're all clear. Vulnerability could also be just admitting when you're wrong to someone and knowing that they may not reciprocate your feelings. It could be sharing a story that's incredibly difficult, recounting a moment that was hard for you, admitting to your spouse that you lost your temper, that you said things that were inappropriate. As a parent, it could be raising children that are kind, humble, loving individuals by showing them or sharing with them stories where you've made mistakes in the past. I think vulnerability can have several different directions that you could take it, just depending on the person you're speaking with, the area that you're at, the location you are. So vulnerability it all depends on the person and the personality.
Yeah. So you've been through numerous deployments with Pat. What does when I say vulnerability and I ask you about your kids and those deployments, what does that mean to you?
Okay, so for the kids, especially as they've gotten older, now that we have a child that's getting ready to be a freshman in high school, vulnerability for him is starting a new school in a new area, a new place, and not knowing a single person. So it's really hard as a parent to encourage him, just keep putting yourself out there, especially to have a child that's quirky and different. And so we've tried to really encourage him to embrace his differences, that differences make the difference. So for him, he feels vulnerable all the time because he's not like all the other children. So as a parent, you feel like you're constantly encouraging him to make good choices. So as a parent, vulnerability is just knowing that your children's hearts are going to be breaking a lot, especially as dad misses holidays, he misses birthdays, he misses anniversaries, he misses all the fun things. He misses the last day of school. He misses the first day of school. So just learning, though, as a parent, especially as the mother and the person that carries everything forward, you got to make it fun. You've got to figure out ways that you can constantly be including them in something fun, different, and you set the tone for how your life will live. So how your children will do in any situation all depends off the vibe and the energy you're giving to them at any given moment. Right. So if I wake up in the morning and I'm poopy, my kids are probably going to be pretty poopy too. So I've got to set the tone for how our family lives.
Absolutely. Number 3 on the list is Dan Damshin. His definition is short and sweet, but it's probably one of my favorites. And I don't need to belabor the point anymore. A lot of you out there know Dan, great person, great leader. And let's listen to Dan's definition of vulnerability. What would your definition of vulnerability be?
Vulnerability meaning to me is like essentially just recognizing that maybe like you don't know everything, and there's new challenges out there that maybe that that you just haven't faced before, and recognizing those challenges and or like spots in your career or your life or any specific thing like that, and facing them, knowing that like maybe I'm not going to be the best at this right away, but I could be if I just challenge myself.
All right, following Dan Damshin there, we have Raye Perez. Raye is one of the smartest and best critical thinkers I know. Raye received his MBA from Emory University a few years ago. And if you're somebody out there that's thinking about going and getting going to higher education, specifically going to get an MBA, and you want to go to an elite, or an upper tier, a place like Emory or Harvard or Columbia, Raye's episode is a great place to start, because Raye's background would not lead you to think that he would end up going to getting his MBA from a place like Emory University. So definitely go check out Raye's episode if you have some fears or anxiety about applying to one of these universities. I think his episode will be a great tool for you to help get through that. And his talk on vulnerability is also really good. So let's take a listen to Raye. And I just curious, what's your definition of vulnerability? What does it mean to you? Where have you used it in your life or seen it used? And what's your take on it?
Yeah, I gave this quite a bit of thought, obviously before, because of I wanted to, do this. I had some idea where I thought I'd walk in here and define vulnerability, and I realized that's never where my strength has been. It's I think that the most valuable experiences I've had with vulnerability are when I decided to bring down a wall that I very intentionally had up. And so in in developing, and so like, let's say in the small unit in CERT, in developing that program and transforming that, there were moments with the cadre where I had to be much more open um, to a lot of high friction from I had cadre from first, second, third bat, like there's a friction in the culture there. And then you have this competing body of students as well. And I think that where I saw the most value there was in being able to uphold the mission and putting down your personal walls to say, like, like, I've never been happier than when I was not that important.
Right.
Like
Oh, yeah.
you're just a dude. We're just dude.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
uh and I had to remind myself of that. And in order to do that, you have to put yourself in a spot as a leader where you fully have the authority or ability to leave that wall up and let the water run around it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you may drown for a little bit. Like, you may start drowning for a little while,
Yeah.
but eventually you have to remember that you know how to swim.
Right.
And so I think that in itself was the experience as a whole. I think vulnerability was at the core of the entire thing.
All right, I hope you guys enjoyed listening to Raye there. Number 5 on our list is Carrie American. Carrie is the wife of Kanan American, who is also on the podcast and has one of the most incredible stories I have ever heard. And I've known the guy for a long time and I found out so much in that hour that I sat and talked with him. Go check out his podcast if you hadn't; it'll blow your mind. And from that podcast with Kanan came questions from other spouses and the ladies out there of they wanted to hear Carrie's side of that story, because it's a phenomenal story, and see how she handled it and coped with going through all of that stuff that with her husband. So Carrie's one of the sweetest people you ever meet. Carrie also has a great short and sweet definition of vulnerability, and I think you guys will enjoy it. Let's take a listen to Carrie. But we'll get straight into the primary focus of this podcast, the vulnerability, and I'll ask you what your definition of vulnerability is before we really get into the conversation.
Right at the beginning.
Yeah, right up front.
Right off the bat. I've thought about it a lot, and I've heard, what different people say, like asking for help and, being transparent or honest. But as I've thought about it, I was like, I love this definition. And it doesn't say like, this is the definition of vulnerability, but I have a good friend who has those Dove dark chocolates where they have the little sayings in them. And she has a Dove dark chocolate wrapper taped up on her cabinet, and it says, "Be fearlessly authentic."
Oh, yes.
And to me, I think that's just a really great definition that encapsulates vulnerability.
I agree 100%. That's actually very close to my definition, which is like owning your truest self unapologetically.
Yes.
That's vulnerability. Next is my friend Dan Ferreter. If you guys know Dan, Dan's a great person, great leader. He's fun to work with. I really enjoyed sitting down and talking with Dan. I enjoy anytime Dan enters a room, you're going to smile. And he also has another really good take on vulnerability. And for his episode specifically, if you're a junior officer or considering joining the military and taking the officer path, Dan's episode is a great place to start with the podcast. Go check it out. And here, let's take a listen to Dan's definition of vulnerability. So what's your definition of vulnerability? What does that word mean to you?
Yeah, so vulnerability to me is the it starts with humility. It starts with allowing yourself to acknowledge that you may not have everything in control, which is hard. It's hard for us. We're taught to try to control as much as we can, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so whether purposefully or not, so vulnerability to me is acknowledging that we don't have everything in control, and then having the humility to seek seek counsel, seek help, seek the friendships, to turn and say, hey, I'm struggling here, and the struggle may be I'm struggling mentally, physically, emotionally, or hey, I'm struggling with this, how to plan this operation. I'm struggling with how to talk to the boss. Or I'm struggling with my family.
Yeah.
And so so that's what I'd say, like with vulnerability.
Next, we have Pat Merrick, Gold Star mother. Again, one of the nicest, sweetest people you will ever meet. Probably the hardest podcast I've done, emotionally for me, because she's the mom, obviously, of Matthew Commons, who was killed in Afghanistan, and was my roommate. And I went to Rangers selection with Matt. Sitting down and talking to her about vulnerability was it was like therapy for both of us, because we'd kind of stayed apart from each other over the years, because we didn't want to bring back bad memories about Matt to each other, and we worked through a lot of that just through this conversation. So her definition of vulnerability starts with her literally looking up the definition of vulnerability in the dictionary, which is what I did when I first started, after I read Daring Greatly and Brene Brown's book. That's what I did. I went and looked up the definition. So I think you'll enjoy her take on vulnerability. We'll jump straight into the question that everybody gets asked on here, to the definition of vulnerability and what you think of that.
Well, I thought about that a lot when you sent me the questions, and I finally had to look it up because
Yeah, I was the same way.
I wasn't really sure. But initially, all I could think of as a definition was weakness,
Right.
and then and so it meant to me that to be vulnerable, you had to open yourself up. Um, so you had to let people know what your weaknesses were. And because I'm single now, and I have been now for 20 years, and I tend not to ask people for help.
Right, yes.
I figure I can do this myself, whether it kills my back or my legs or whatever. And I'm pretty stubborn when it comes to that. And so I realized, I don't let my vulnerability show. And it made me really stop and think about vulnerability. A funny story, though, is one time I thought I could do some plumbing on my own. That was a big mistake. I had water gushing out everywhere, and I finally had to call a plumber to come and fix what I did, and it cost me about 4 times the amount of what I should have called somebody right away. But I thought I could do it, and I couldn't. But, and I as I get older, I have to admit that there's things I can't do, and I have to be more vulnerable and allow people to see my weaknesses.
Yeah. For number 8, we're going to go back to another early episode and guest and good friend of mine, Josh Jacobs. Josh, in his definition, ties in empathy with vulnerability in his definition, and how they both lead to emotional intelligence, which affects leadership, which you guys all know I a lot of my guests and myself included have talked a lot about emotional intelligence and the importance of understanding self. So let's listen into Josh's definition of vulnerability. Before we talk about vulnerability, I think it's important to define it. So vulnerability can mean a lot of things. One thing it definitely doesn't mean, in my view, it doesn't mean weakness. It's not weakness being vulnerable. I speak often about vulnerability. Some of the best times of our lives when we're most vulnerable. When we're sitting there watching our kids be born, right? We're standing at the altar waiting for our spouse to walk down the aisle. When you're giving your first big jump master pitch, I mean, you feel pretty vulnerable up on that platform about to pitch. But when you're done, you feel the feeling that comes from it. So vulnerability is not weakness. I just wonder what vulnerability means to you.
Yeah, I guess for vulnerability, there's so many different ways to describe it. And in the beginning of our careers, and I think I can speak for both of us on this one, we didn't really have much in the way of an environment that was empathetic or provided any type of emotional intelligence. There was none of that. That didn't exist. All right, so I would say for the first 7-8 years of my life in the 75th Ranger Regiment, with what I would like to call my second family, there was no empathy. There was no process for sharing feelings, having feelings. You were steely-eyed killer, as we used to call it back in the day. And you were expected to be that alpha in the room at all times. When you're in a leadership position, and that was the overall mantra of, I would say, special operations as a whole. And so as we continue to learn and grow, and we continue to develop as human beings, and grow in both our leadership capacity and capability and our understanding of individuals, we gain this bit of emotional intelligence and empathy. And again, it's kind of like for the NCOs, it's like the mentorship process. You don't really talk about it. There's no direct correlation, at least as we were growing up, to where there's a process and somebody explains to you what empathy and emotional intelligence are. That didn't happen until later on in our careers. We were doing some leader professional development, and then as I began to take college classes and go down that road of what is empathy, what is emotional intelligence, what do those things mean, why are they important, how do they build a person other than just building them through pain and repetition of military training. How do we build them emotionally? How do we create empathy within the individual so that they can better understand the people within their formation, so that they can understand where those people are coming from, and be able to take that understanding and convert that into a better leadership process to their subordinates.
We didn't have a good definition of it when you were there. I think back when we were growing up, vulnerability and empathy and all that was weakness. Like, it was reviewed as weakness, right? But just because you're empathetic and expose vulnerability and are open with your guys and talk about emotional intelligence doesn't mean you don't hold them accountable. Doesn't mean there's not a standard. It probably means there's probably a higher standard because you're more open and honest with one another and more transparent. So just reframing it and heading it up, and you hit the nail on the head, like the emotional intelligence. Understanding yourself is the key to everything, in my view. At number 9, we have Tony Main. His is another short, straightforward definition of vulnerability, and it's one that I really like because he doesn't really question it. Some people kind of question, the meanings, because it could have a lot of different meanings to a lot of different people. Tony doesn't really do that. He says vulnerability is one word, and it's an important word, and it's a word that you guys are all familiar with. And let's listen to Tony's short, sweet, simple definition of vulnerability. And I'll ask you a 2-part question.
All right.
Because I don't know how I missed it. I want to know your definition of vulnerability, and I think it'll tie in well to you spent a majority of your time in the GWAT. How did that shape you as a leader, person, husband, father, everything you are now?
All right. So first, vulnerability. How do I define it? I try to relate everything back, and this goes to my faith. I try to. The best thing that we can do is to be Christ-like. The way that we become Christ-like is to show love. So, what is the definition of vulnerability? Showing others love, not expecting it in return.
Following Tony at number 10 is Justin Lane. Again, short and sweet and to the point, and it just shows that leading with vulnerability is not difficult. It's something that we should not overanalyze. It's something you can do, and probably are already. Some of you are already doing in your leadership and how you lead. Um, this is another great episode if you're considering becoming a military officer. Justin took the ROTC route into the Army and has some great, just some great lessons learned and some great points for current or aspiring military or Army officers. So let's take a listen in on Justin Lane. What would your definition of vulnerability be?
I think it means to have an open mind and an open heart, and be willing to, receive feedback and criticism, and be eager and empathetic to hear other stories.
Yeah.
And to use those things that you've struggled with throughout your life, or your own weaknesses, as opportunities to help others, grow.
Yeah. Number 11, we have Matthew Ball, former 175 Ranger and current Emory MBA candidate. He's, motivated and inspired by guys like Raye Perez, who, went up there and got an MBA, and he's up there doing it now. His definition is, again, it's pretty short and to the point, but I think it's spot on if you're a leader in a new role or a new place, or if you're in the military and you're a young leader, young team leader, young NCO. It applies. His definition applies, I think, in both fields, and is very important, and shows it ties in. You'll see what he says is big with humility as well. So let's listen in on Matt. What's yours?
So I think, like, as far as, my time in the regiment, vulnerability to me as a leader would be, being comfortable and willing to being comfortable knowing you know nothing about most things.
Yeah.
And being open and willing to communicate that, both up and down.
Yeah.
Being willing to tell the leadership, like, hey, I'm stretched a little thin here,
Right.
or being open to the guys in the squad or the platoon, saying, like, it's okay that the squad leader doesn't know what he's doing right now.
Right. Next up at number 12, we have Lee Garcia. Lee is a retired 75th Ranger. Lee has a great take on vulnerability and how it ties directly into leadership. Lee continues to do that and lead with vulnerability and lead from the front in the community, and continues to give back to the military community and see how he can help guys and girls and just service members in general be more open and vulnerable so that they can have more fulfilling lives. Lee would be the first one to tell you he tries to stay in the shadows and not be seen, and doesn't want any of the attention for what he does. But I'll just say here, Lee does great work around here in Harris County in Georgia, where we live close to Fort Benning, and I think he has a great take and definition on vulnerability. Just what's Lee Garcia's definition of vulnerability, and why is it important?
So I'll start before defining it. As I was growing up and I started becoming a leader in the organization, I was always told, never admit your mistakes, never let anybody see weakness. And I soon learned very quickly that was just wrong advice, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I always tried to make it to where my guys knew, like, hey, here's where I screwed up. Here's what went wrong. My bad. I made the bad decision, but we're going to move on with it. So that they knew and understood it was okay to fail. And I think it's a big part of vulnerability is admitting when you're wrong and just opening up to people and telling them, like, hey, look, I don't got all the answers.
Right.
I know I'm a big, bad Ranger NCO. I'm a first sergeant, whatever else. I should beat my chest. And, when I was a private, I looked at a Ranger first sergeant as a god. They did no wrong.
Demigods, yep.
And then once I got to that point, I realized, hey, I've screwed up way too many times in my career. And as I got older and started talking to other guys, like, hey, how did you become a first sergeant? Like, hey, I know some of the crap you've done.
Yeah.
And I realized we're all flawed.
Yeah.
And to not be able to admit that to those guys was doing an injustice
Right.
To them as their leader.
Right.
Because they felt that they had to be perfect all the time.
Yeah.
And knowing that I had messed up and I had made mistakes, my guys were going to mess up and make mistakes, and at some point they're going to be in leadership positions. They had to understand that was okay, and we learned from it. And if I was lying to them and pretending I would be perfect, they wouldn't be able to trust me.
Yep.
And if they couldn't trust me, they were going to communicate with me. And if we couldn't communicate, we couldn't build a good team.
Right.
Bottom line. And so that's a big part of what vulnerability means. It's just opening up, communicating, and allowing people to trust you.
And last, number 13, I chose 13. Hope it's not unlucky, but it's former 75th Ranger PL and NFL offensive lineman Ali Villanueva. So Ali is one of the only guests I think that used the word weakness in his definition. Because you often hear me say that vulnerability is not weakness, but I think the way he uses it makes a lot of sense, and it's not necessarily in a bad light or weakness in a negative way. But Ollie was a great podcast. It was great flying down to Miami and spending some time with my wife and doing that podcast in the hotel. And I still thanks to Ali for coming in and doing that. But I think you guys enjoy his definition of vulnerability. And let's finish out this with Ollie's definition. What's your definition of vulnerability?
Well, I mean, my definition, I would say is, I think everybody has innate weaknesses. Whether you are, because you consider yourself the best or the worst. You're not perfect. Nobody's perfect, yeah. And so you have to learn how to live with your imperfections. And those that have the confidence about how to overcome those imperfections and those weaknesses, whether it's relying on others, whether it's understanding that they have to work harder, whether it's they have to listen more. I think those people usually have the appearance of being more approachable and more successful than those that do not see their weaknesses,
yeah.
And or what they're vulnerable to.
All right, that closes it out. I hope you enjoyed listening to Ollie's definition of vulnerability there. I hope you enjoyed reliving some of these definitions in this format the way I did. Like I said, I really enjoyed putting this podcast together. And if you haven't listened to some of those episodes in their entirety and you want to hear more, make sure you go check it out on your favorite podcasting platform or YouTube. And we're going to bring it in. We're going to land this plane on episode 37 of the podcast. And I'm going to do that by answering another question that I'm often asked about this podcast. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. When I took on this venture as a podcast, I didn't know how difficult it was going to be. It is a difficult task. It's very time consuming. Just ask my wife. But every time I'm feeling down or worry that the message or the podcast isn't reaching the right people or views are low on a certain episode, or I have trouble booking guests and, getting people to come on and all the things that go along with trying to do this, I will inevitably get a note, a message, a text, an email that kind of refires me up. And I wanted to share some of the comments that I've been sent about this podcast, just so you understand kind of the impact that it's having outside of maybe what you realize. So I had a comment just yesterday come in on Brian Marks's episode where, the episode of age, just a number, because Brian joined service at 40 years old and is now 52 and still serving. The unknown user on YouTube said, "This is what I needed. I'm getting ready to join at 30 and hearing this is perfect." I had another comment on that same episode, said, "This is a big inspiration. I'm breaching my 33rd birthday." He's been in the enlistment process for about 4 months, and if all goes as planned, he'll get approved to join service next week. That came from Billy Fletcher on YouTube about Brian Marks's episode. And for everybody out there listening and has listened to Brian's episode, yes, I know the audio is off on Brian. I'm sorry, Brian. I contemplated whether I wanted to post that one or not, or try to reshoot it. But as you know, if anybody out there does something like this, booking a reshoot and doing that is difficult. So I went ahead and cleaned it up the best I could in all the programs I have, and I posted it. And I thought about taking it down when I got a lot of negative feedback about "Fix your sound, dude," and "This is a terrible production." But then I go and get comments where this episode, even with its poor quality sound, helped somebody out. So I'm just going to leave it up there and deal with the internet trolls going forward. But I apologize, Brian. You being a commo guy, at least I know you understand. Another comment I had is one from my military child interview when I interviewed my son. It says, "This is everything. I really enjoyed this in my heart." And that came from Lisa Griffin on YouTube. And I appreciate the comments. Great story. The podcast causes me to reflect on my current purpose. So thank you. Commenting on the Veterans Day special. That was Joshua on the YouTube comment. A couple more here. I've watched a video for Ranger Commons, who was killed. I posted a video about him. Incredibly powerful. I sat down with all my platoon sergeants, platoon leaders, and squad leaders, and we watched it this past fall. Keep sharing these stories, please. That's from Seth Gross. He's an Army officer, former Ranger, and he sent that message to me via Facebook. I've been listening to your podcast, and I have to say that it has been awesome. Has brought me down memory lane with some of the guests, and I've tried reflecting on the moments that I've been vulnerable. And that was another via Facebook message that I got from a former service member. And another one here. I have had my company leadership watching Lieutenant Colonel Farrader's episode for our next LPD. That's a former platoon leader that worked with me when I was the first sergeant in DECO, Delta Company 375. So, I always say the power of one. If this helps one person have a better day or try to achieve a goal that they thought previously impossible, it's worth it. And you can tell by some of those comments that it's worth it, and keep them coming, because they keep me going. They keep me fired up when I'm sitting here alone late hours trying to edit some of this stuff and fix poor sound quality on some of the podcasts. Thank you very much for all that you have for everybody who's listened. And again, this is the part about me being vulnerable, the thing I don't like to do, but I got to do if I want to continue doing this. But if you'd like to support the show, please check out the Leading with Vulnerability Patreon page. It's at www.patreon.com/leadingwithvulnerability. You can give a monthly donation to the show. That really supports me and helps me. I think I have 14 people on there now, and I cannot tell you how much those 14 people help me in the production of this podcast. A lot of people don't want to become a patron and do a monthly membership, and I understand that. We all have enough streaming services and other platforms that we're subscribed to. I get it. And they just want to leave a one-time donation or buy some Leading with Vulnerability merchandise. So if you want to do that, just go to the podcast page on barnettmultimedia.com. No www. Don't put it in there. It won't take you there. Just barnettmultimedia.com. And you can do a one-time donation, or you can just shoot me a message or an email, and I can direct you if that's what you want to do. And for those of you who continue to listen and support, I really appreciate it. I mean, I can't. I would hug you all right now if I could. So I hope you enjoyed today's show. As always, please like, share, subscribe, and comment. That really does help. It drives the algorithms. When you push all you do is click a like button or leave a short comment. It will drive it and get more viewership, and hopefully reach that one person that needs to hear that episode. So signing off from here today, check in with you guys next week, and thanks for listening.